Hello and welcome to this video, which is the next installment in my series of Hardy Boys books detailing my collection. This video will go through what fans commonly refer to as the Hardy Boys Digest books, which start at book 59 as a way of continuing the original canon books, even though it's a different publisher and it's technically separate from the canon, but to kind of explain how this all came about, just very briefly, because it is very confusing if you just get into these or you're trying to learn more about how the books progressed over time. Basically, Grosset and Dunlap in about 1979 had just completed, book 58, Sting of the Scorpion. Were looking to move on to book 59, which is Night of the Werewolf, and but then they got involved in a legal dispute that was about the continuing publishing rights to the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, amongst other things. So it basically, what eventually happened was the rights for the original books that had already been published, what is referred to as the original canon, so for the Hardy Boys, that's volumes 1 through 58, remained with Grosset and Dunlap, and they were able to, actually to this day, they still continue to reprint those, but they were not allowed to publish any new books. So those at the Street Miner Syndicate went over to Simon & Schuster, who wound up with the rights, and they were the ones who published the digests and pretty much everything else from then on out under various different imprints over the years. But books 59 through 80 were still completely done by the Straight Meyer Syndicate, their ghostwriters, their editors, things like that. So if you're trying to figure out which of the digests tie into the original canon books, you could really look at it at least as books 59 through 80. 81 through 83 were still written by the ghostwriters of the Syndicate, but they were not edited by the Syndicate. They were done by Simon & Schuster. Then for books 84 and 85, Simon & Schuster did it completely in-house, so had their own writers, their own editors and such. And then after that, there was about a year break of no new books. And then the publisher wound up farming it out, the whole writing, editing, everything, to a company or entity known as Megabooks. And that lasted from about book 86 all the way to volume 153. And then after that, Simon & Schuster wound up doing books 154 to the final book, which is volume 190, completely in-house. And I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but that's why this series ran so long and why it picks up at book 59. So it's generally meant to be a continuation of the original 58 canon books, and some could argue very easily that at least the first 20 to 30 books up through, depending on how you feel about them, books 80 or 83 or even 85 are technically part of the original canon. If Grosset and Dunlap had kept the rights through the 1980s, those would have just been published with the others in the picture cover design, because it was the same team and ghostwriters and editors and such. For the most part, Simon & Schuster started doing some, after book 80. So that's why I think you could say at least books 59 through 80 are sort of in this weird in-between zone where they're technically, they should be considered original canon, but they're not, because they're not Grosset and Dunlap, but it's the same creative team that did the last 20 or so books of the original canon. So that's why I wanted to explain that for a second. And a lot of this information can be found online. Particularly the best place is hardyboys.us, the amazing fan resource that I know I mentioned in the other videos I did. And if you've not visited there, I'll put a link in the description below. It's the Hardy Boys 101 source for all information. It is a extraordinarily well-researched site, and I must recommend it if you're at all, if you collect Hardy Boys or other children's books, you've probably already been there. You probably already know it well. But if you're just getting into this, or you have fond memories and want to read some of the books again, that should be your first stop in order to look at different cover arts, find out about the different series, and get more information. But I just wanted to run through a little bit so that way this video might make a little bit more sense. And also, there are a number of reprints of these books, but which explains why some have more than one cover art variation. But after that, they have not been reprinted, so they're getting trickier and trickier to find. Unfortunately, I don't have a complete collection, but I'm chipping away at it. I find a few volumes here and there, but I have a good number of them in some of the alternate cover arts and so on and so forth. That's why I've got these 4 examples here to show you the 4 main cover art variations. There are 1 or 2 others. Really, most people refer to there being 5, but the 5th one is just a single book variant where book 83, the first printing, has a completely different cover scheme for no apparent reason, and it was never used again. I just don't happen to have a copy of that to show you. But that's a lone exception. The 4 main types you're going to be looking at are right here. The original cover design is on the first number of books, and they all feature this same sort of they feature the exact same layout. So you have the Hardy Boys logo here, you have a sort of window onto the cover art, so you're only getting a section of it, then you have the title here, and then the color of the background and the color of the border and everything changes with each volume. They all do have these nice matching spines, and they look really good on a shelf, and they have the number in a circle there, so it's very stylized. Here's the rear, which matches. So yeah, you get used to it. I'm sure most who grew up with these are familiar. But you can also tell why when they reprinted these, they modernized them with covers to match what was then current. So this is version 1. Version 2, again, accepting that 1 copy of book 83 that's different for no apparent reason. This is the more common version because this is what all the original books were reprinted as. This is actually a reprint of book 65, which you'll see the different cover when we get to it in a little bit. It's sometimes referred to as the checkerboard style cover because this little bar under the Hardy Boys logo has a little checkerboard pattern. That's an easy way to refer to these, but they all are pretty much the same design. The cover art fills up almost the entirety of the book, front jacket, and then you have a background border color peeking through, and it's always a particular shade that fades into white on the bottom for some reason. Why that is, I don't quite know. Don't worry that your book is just faded. They're actually designed that way. So if you look at these in used bookshops, you might think they've been left in the sun for ages, but that's just how they are. The back is a little bit more generic looking, but again, a good majority of the series were published this way. And again, all of the reprints of the early books were printed with this style of cover. Something else I should mention is the original books all featured internal illustrations. Not quite the same design style as the canon books, but in some ways more intricate. They are full page, they're still black and white, and they still have that sort of pencil sketch type feel to them. But these are a lot more detailed than what you got in the canon books, where it was very much about, being more like line drawings. These are like more full-on sketches, and they're really quite good for the most part. Unfortunately, they eventually stopped doing these on the later books, and then sometimes when they reprinted these originals, they would drop the internal illustrations as well. So that's another reason why you might want to track down the original printings for the first number of books, not just because the cover's different, but because they will maintain the internal illustrations. The texts are pretty much the same. There are a few exceptions. 59 is one where they made a few little tweaks and fixed an error or two. But of course, that comes at the cost of losing the illustrations and stuff. So, and also I think it's really cool to try and complete a set of the original cover art designs. So anyway, then the third cover art variation used throughout the mid-90s is this, which is sort of a strange hybrid. It's still, it's still art, but it's done in a sort of photo. It's a photographic style, almost like you've literally taken a snapshot. I've never been a super big fan of this. The logo looks really weird, and then the titles have a sort of like you've cut and pasted a piece of lettering tape, and then you have the number here in a black box. some of these covers, like this one, it works okay, but some have the distinct feeling like it's like a photo collage, but like the old style photo collage where you'd have to actually cut out newspaper or magazine photos, and it kind of has this glossy look to it. And then like you've just literally glued it on a piece of paper, and sometimes the dimensions look a little weird. So this is definitely my least favorite art style of the digest books, but a good majority of these had this. None of the reprints came in the later styles, but just the first two. But this is the third major style, and then they changed the spines. So it definitely will throw you if you're building a collection on your shelf, because all the spines of this iteration are yellow with black text, and they go together pretty well, but it's kind of jarring. Let me just show you the difference, just so you get an idea. So here you have this nice logo and everything. Here you still have the same logo and it fits, and these two series, fit on a shelf together, and then they suddenly turn yellow, and that just is really strange. The backs of these are red, which at least has some more visual stuff going on compared to the second iteration, and the text is again much more blocky to fit the sort of lettering design that still carries on there. And then the last major design, even though this one is much more generic, I like the feel of this a lot more than the previous edition style. This one, it feels a lot more succinct, and while you don't have the boys on the cover, which is really weird because they've been on practically every cover since the Tower Treasure, and that's a key feature. They've instead gone for this idea of actual literal, like you're pulling case files. So you still have the number, you still have a much more classic looking logo, but then each book cover will have a particular event or photo, like it's literally been, you can almost picture there's a paperclip holding this on, and it's a picture of what looks like a plague diseased rats. So yeah, and you have this little spiral notebook type design, and here again is this file. So the idea is like you're pulling it out of a filing cabinet. So I get it. It doesn't have as much personality, but I think it's definitely less garish than this design was. And here, the spines again are colored. They started out being sort of the color of an actual file folder, and then eventually switched over to this blue for the last ones. So again, it again does not match, which is unfortunate. But again, I'm glad they switched to blue, because most of the original books are blue, and the picture covers and the canon and stuff. And this feels a lot more like the Hardy Boys as opposed to this yellow. You also get the title in this sort of file folder sticker with what looks like it's written out on a typewriter for the title, which is a cute thing, and they maintain that on all of these last books. But again, if you're building a shelf of digest books, do not expect the spines to match, because as you can see right here, they just don't. So unfortunately, there was not a notion to at least keep the design similar. But of course, these books lasted from 1979 was Night of the Werewolf, and then the final book, which is book number 190, was published in 2005. So we're talking about a long range here, particularly in publishing. So it's understandable that the covers changed a whole lot and don't match the entirety of the time. But it's a brief, basic overall run through of the digest books. And again, I'll put a link in the description box below to hardyboys.us, which has it's a phenomenal resource of information. And you can find a little blurb about each book and then the different cover arts and such. But I just wanted to kind of explain it a little bit first, so it might make sense why, the covers completely change, the designs change. And you can even tell by looking at some of the covers, the stories kind of change a little bit. There are some books that are reputed to be, books that were not used in the case files. They were just repurposed as digests and other things like that. So after the first 80, after books 80 to 85 or so, they can kind of vary in quality. I have not read all of them because unfortunately I don't own all through 190. But all the ones that I've read, they're still very solid. They still feel like a Hardy Boys book. They're still told in the traditional sense. And in a lot of ways, when this series ended, we've not yet gotten a return to the classic style established in the original canon books. But thankfully, with the digest, they go to book 190, so you have plenty to choose from. So with that said, let's start, and I will start at book 59, and we'll run through all my various editions up through what I've accumulated to this point. So here we have, of course, book 59, Night of the Werewolf. And if you saw my book on the canon books, I talked a little bit about these to close that out. These are the Grosson and Dunlap reprints of the first few digest books. They were made in 2005, and it must have been some sort of licensing deal with Simon & Schuster. But they got the rights and did a single print run in the then current plastic cover flashlight picture cover design used for the original 58 canon books. And I just stumbled across them literally in 2005. I walked into a Books A Million and suddenly noticed a bunch of extra books on the end of the shelf for both the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and didn't really pay attention at first because I had the canon. But then I suddenly noticed, sticking out is Night of the Werewolf in the modern canon book cover, and I'm like, well, this is bizarre. So what happened was, for that short period of time, they published the first handful of both Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew digests in the now classic flashlight or plastic cover design of the original canon books. And they literally have the identical design, and they fit together on the shelf. But unfortunately, this was short-lived. They did not republish the whole series, which would have been great because, as I mentioned before, once all these books were published, particularly after they stopped the series at book 190, there have been no reprints. So these are getting more and more difficult to find. So for both the Hardys and Nancy Drew, these are now becoming quite collectible because they only had one print run. And as you can see, they have the original art, but they don't have it inside of the window design. So you actually get a bit more of the original art, but of course it's been stretched to fit the modern book, and it's got the title put up here in yellow, and all the titles are in yellow for some reason. So you have that. So some of the art is obscured, and some of the coloring is a bit different. It's much more bold and vibrant here on the original book, and you can definitely tell it's been designed around, or at least centered in everything, so it works within this frame. Whereas this, it's just kind of shoved into the admittedly bigger but modern format. So it's a trade-off, but again, it's an interesting variant, and they only had one print run of these, so they're not like extraordinarily rare or very valuable, but they're definitely more valuable than your standard Hardy Boys book you'll find kicking around in the plastic cover design. So where one of those will be a couple dollars in this day and age, these will probably be worth 2 to 3 times that amount in good shape. So a standard book might cost you anywhere from $2 to $5 in a bookshop, and if it's particularly if it's a store that knows about the Hardy Boys in particular, this might cost you say $5 or $10, if not a little bit more. What's also interesting is this uses the original text. So in addition to the cover, you have the internal illustrations. So this is another way of getting a first edition copy with the illustrations and original text, because again, this is one of the books that had a few little tweaks done to fix some typos and things, but they actually went back and used the original text with the illustrations, which is really cool. So if you don't have a first printing, you manage to find one of these, you'll be in pretty good shape. Just to show you inside this one, and again, you'll also be able to tell these are a bit different because the text is different, the layout, everything is different compared to the original canon books, but it's the same feeling. And again, all the way through book 80, they were still done by the original Straightmire Syndicate team and ghostwriters and editors and everything. So, at least books 59 through 80 are going to feel pretty close to what you get in the original canon books, particularly the later half. Let me just show you in comparison, because this book is a little bit bigger in dimensions. It's pretty much the same, as you can see, and it has the same original text block and everything. I really do appreciate how they kept that. And just like the original canon books, they've never changed the text block. So even the most modern reprintings, the cover's different, but as soon as you open it, it's the same text layout and everything. So I thought that was nice that they, at least back in the late 70s, tried to have some consistency with the canon. And of course, Book 58, as I showed in my other video, if you have first edition, it has a plug in it for Night of the Werewolf. So this was written, conceived, and planned to be in the canon as Book 59. But of course, Grosson and Dunlap lost the rights, so that's what caused all that. So in a lot of ways, this was sort of coming full circle, and it's a shame they didn't get to do. Well, they obviously couldn't do all of them through 190, but it's a shame they didn't get to do more of them. So these exist through book 66, and just if you come across them, I definitely recommend go ahead and pick them up, because they're just, again, they only had one print run, so they're just going to increase in rarity and desirability. So anyway, those are my editions of book 59. And then moving on, it's pretty much the same scenario for all these through 66, because I very thankfully bought all of these back when I found them, back when they were new, and then I've just had them on the shelf ever since. Here we have Mystery of the Samurai Sword, and again, it's the exact same scenario. I have a first printing here with the plastic cover reprint from 2005. And again, you have the original has the artwork. It just comes across better. It's a little bit bolder. On all of these, the skin tones seem a little bit weird. I don't know if the copying process went oddly or whatever. But again, you do get more of the original art revealed in terms of dimensions. But you have the title here in yellow. Again, why they're all yellow, I don't know. I don't know if it was just one person doing all of these, and did this as like a one-off to see if there's going to be interest. But it's again cool that you get more of the original art, but you can tell that this was again sized just right, and they figured out how to get everything there, because here you have this section detailing an important part of the plot, but here on the reprint, it's barely there. It's like they literally just worried about getting the boys there, and I mean this part looks quite nice, and it's nice having more headroom and everything. But again, you can tell it's like both of these, they're cutting off parts of the original art. So it's not like you're getting to see the whole of the original painting, but you can tell this has been fully optimized, where this has not. But again, it's cool that this happened, and that we did get to see at least a little bit more of the original art. Be really cool if you could go to a museum and see all of the original paintings, but unfortunately, that opportunity does not exist. So you. And again, they stuck with this same text block and everything for all of the, really the first major wave of books. So I'm going to flip there and try and just to give you an idea. They don't always have a front illustration like the original canon, but there's usually an illustration within the first few pages. And then, of course, the other plus, they did move and put a front illustration at the front of the reprints, which is interesting. I guess they did that to further tie in to the original books, but that is one difference you'll note if you have these side by side. And then on this one, they changed the front title page to match how it looks on a canon book, but then as soon as you flip in, it has the original contents page, and then the text is the same style as the original printing. So that's another thing they did. And here's that same illustration. Here you can tell the printing's a little bit lighter, but that may be because of the paper stock being much newer. And of course, with all of these more modern books, it's much whiter. It's a brighter paper. So that's another thing. If you like newer books, you might want to go ahead and pick these up, because it just might be easier on the eyes or something. Because these books, being older from the 70s and 80s, they can by now have a tendency to sort of have age or a little bit of browning, but that's just it's just going to happen with time. Just to show you the rear of these really quick. So here you have the same design and layout identical to the other books with the plastic covers. And then here you have the rear of the original printings. And of course, all of these are under the Wanderer imprint, the first of the several imprints the digests wind up on. It's the same scenario here with Book 61, The Pentagon Spy. I have an original Wanderer edition here, and then the Groston and Dunlap plastic cover reprint. Again, you get more of the art on the top. You get the title here in yellow, but again, the sides are kind of cropped, and it's not optimized for the sizing as the original is. And again, this has a sort of slightly washed out look to it, so it's definitely a trade-off. But again, it's cool to get these original artworks in the canon style. So it's a nice thing. And again, it's kind of cool to see these because these are technically like the lost canon books, the first of the digest. So it's cool to see them in this format. And of course, the rears, same scenario. This is the Wanderer style. This is the same rear cover on all of the plastic cover books. So there's the original title page, contents, and then here, of course, they've put the illustration up front, and here is the reconformed title page. But then they go right back to the original style. So I can't believe they put all the effort in on the front, but I guess it's nice that they did. And then here's that same image there from page 20. So here we go with the Ape Man Secret, and again, it's the exact same scenario with all of these. The original's more optimized, the layout's better, the color's a bit better. These look a little bit washed out. Again, the title's here in yellow, which doesn't exactly go with a lot of them. And as you can see, it's literally over the titular Ape Man's face. So I guess his face literally has a secret. But again, it's cool that this happened, and again, it was a one-off. So I'm glad I got all of these because they're pretty hard to find now. They turn up every once in a while. Unfortunately, I did not get the Nancy Drew one, so I've gotten one or two of those. But yeah, basically, if you stumble across one of these, just go ahead and pick it up if it's cheap because you probably won't see it again for a long while. So I'm going to show you the rears, which again, these were all standardized, so it's just going to be the different text and the different color to match the front. Title and content page, and then here's the first illustration. Again, I do hand it to them that they at least put the effort in to put an illustration up front, and it's cool to see these with the canon style of title page. But if everything else is going to be original, first printing style, I don't know why they would do that. But yeah, it's they somebody had put some sort of thought into these, so that is a nice touch. Here for the mummy case, exact same scenario, so I'm not going to repeat myself again, but basically you can see it's the same thing with the art. Here, the title in yellow at least fits into the cover, but they've literally cut the mummy out of the cover. So they literally took this image, gave you more headroom, and did this. And so the mummy looming in the background ominously, you just see a blob there. So you would have no idea. But yeah, I just find it kind of funny when they just literally lop things out like that are kind of important. Let's show you. Here on page 8 is the illustration. Then here in the reprint, So for Mysterious Smuggler's Cove, it's the same scenario. Here, the background is not quite cropped out as bad. There, at least the figures are still there, but again, sizing is not optimal, and the title being in this generic yellow is a little weird. But again, it's just it's cool that this happened for at least the first few books. I'll just show you the rear of the Wanderer edition. Show you title page, contents. On page 13, this first illustration. So here it is in the reprint. And then we go right back to the original content style. There's the illustration there. Then for the Stone Idol, I actually do have the second iteration. So here you have the three main versions of this book. So here's the original Wanderer version. This is the second Wanderer version with the, for lack of a better term, the checkerboard style cover. And again, it's a completely different cover art, which some of, you can kind of flip-flop on which you like. For the books that have multiple cover arts, sometimes the checkerboard is a lot more dramatic, but then sometimes the original Wanderer first version has more of a charm to it. So you have to kind of pick and choose which you like. But nowadays, these are getting so hard to find. You're not even paying attention to the cover as much, so long as if it's a good condition copy, just trying to fill in your collection gaps. And then here we have the reprint that repurposes the first art. So to show you the difference in these, again, it's practically the same size spine, same text, same everything. This one does maintain the original illustrations as well on the inside, which not all of them do, but they at least did for some of them, so you just have to literally open it and see sometimes. Here, this one, I think this may be a slightly later printing because of the text being a little different, and then the ISBN number being over here on the side, because this doesn't have the same bigger text as the first few books that we just looked at. And of course, you can tell the price difference, this being later, because it's a whole $1 more expensive. But it is, of course, the same book. Now to show you the interior, so there's the title page, contents, and the first main illustration there on page 3. Now, these do feel a lot thicker and sturdier in terms of printing compared to the checkerboard versions. So that is something you will notice. I'm sure it was, ways to, streamline the printing process and cut down on costs and things. But the actual text is pretty much the same. The text block, everything did not change. Let me flip to that illustration really quick. So this is one that does maintain the internal illustrations. And then coming here to the reprint, you have the front illustration and redone title page. And here's the internal illustration. So I have the same scenario for the Vanishing Thieves. We have the original Wanderer version, followed by the checkerboard reprint Wanderer version, and then the 2005 plastic cover reprint. This is one where you can see the difference in art style. The second version has a much more vivid action scene depicted. And again, all of these were done with a pretty realistic bent in mind. But with that said, even though there's a lot more going on here, I still kind of prefer the first art. It's a bit more low key, but it has an element, a vibe to it. There is a looming threat here with this, hand gripping something. They do look like they're, there's about to be peril. So yeah, but either one works. And again, each style has their own fans. But I kind of flip flop, like I said before, on with each individual book, which cover I prefer. So show you the difference in the rear cover, and here it's gotten standardized again. The text here is a little bit bigger and a little bit further spaced out, but once you remove the special logos, that's how these will stay on the second version. And unfortunately, it looks a lot more bland because it's just, a colored background. But, it works. I just wish it, did something else other than have this, lots of dead space there. But again, it's just reprinting this. But all the books of this style will have this same rear cover where it's just text and then a blank color behind it. Show you inside here. Again, the first printing's a bit sturdier in terms of, it feels a bit thicker in the hand. As you can see, the pages on this one have browned a little bit, which is not an issue on the reprint. So that's another thing you might want to take note of if you're somebody who is not a fan of when your older books start to have pages that have browning develop. Unfortunately, this is one that does not maintain the original illustration, so this is a great example of that not happening. But they are included in the reprint version, so at least that's another reason why it's good to pick these up when you find them. So here is the repurposed front illustration and page. Definitely a hairy situation there. And contents. And then let me flip to that illustration. So with volume 67, that of course ends the modern reprints, which only went through volume 66. So from here on out, you don't have to worry about those. So for the Outlaws Silver, I have the original Wanderer printing here, which of course has the spine that matches, and then the matching rear cover. Title page, contents page, and try to... Here's the first illustration. Now, volume 68 is a weird one. It is the one book that has a completely different title on the reprinted versions, as should be pretty obvious. So the original book is entitled The Submarine Caper, and then when Wanderer reprinted it, actually more than once, this is one of the books that has two different printings and cover arts in the checkerboard style pattern. So there's another version of this book, the same layout, but a completely different front art and background color and everything. I don't know why they did that for certain books, but they made more than one in this style for certain books. So that can be very perplexing, and then sometimes you'll wind up buying multiple copies of the same book because of that. But anyway, apparently from what my research and what other fans have seemed to have figured out, this book was originally written in German and was originally titled The Submarine Caper, and then they decided to retitle it. I guess maybe because some might have felt the title was misleading. It's been a little while since I've read this particular one, but if I'm remembering correctly, the whole submarine aspect is not, as major in the plot as the original title might have indicated to people. So, but yeah, the retitled, the second title is maybe a bit more generic. But either one works. I don't think anything was really largely changed in the text itself. They just decided to retitle it when they reissued it with a new cover. So this is one book you might want to have both versions of because the title is totally different. Show you the rear of the Wanderer. Title page, which of course will be different in the reprint because it's a different title. And find... There we go. The first illustration. Then in the reprint, they do at least credit that it was formerly titled The Submarine Caper inside, so that way, as a kid back in the 80s, you would, not buy the same book, or you buy it and suddenly go, wow, I feel like I've read this before. I've been ripped off. So they definitely let you know inside. So if you didn't open it when you bought it and then you get home and realize, oh my God, it's the exact same book, it's at least printed somewhere. You can't sue them. And here's the same illustration there. Just to show you the difference in rear covers. This is one where they actually started putting a small segment of the rear art of the front art on the rear, which I do appreciate. It at least gives it something else going on, and they've changed the text layout so it's not that bold text. And if you look at all of these, put side by side over time, sometimes even later printings of the same reissue, they get a lot more streamlined. It's just like if you put the picture cover copies of the original canon books next to each other, you can tell different vintages by the font they used. And, by the 70s, they switched to Helvetica on everything. So, it kind of varies. And again, since these books were printed over such a large period of time, and then you have books like this that were not only reissued, but retitled, there's, of course, variances and stuff. But by the time this particular copy was printed, they started putting a little block segment, usually of the boys, on the back. So that at least gives you something visually going on the rear, other than just a plain back cover. The original Wanderer books, you at least have the logo and everything. So I just hate it when there's it's just kind of bland. So that's just something I always pick up on when it's just like there's literally nothing going on. So for the four-headed dragon, I just have the original Wanderer version. The art's quite nice. It has a sort of surreal vibe to it, definitely, with this giant dragon coming out of a large mansion. So yeah, that definitely is eye-catching. And I do like these more subdued colors. I like this one being sort of a burgundy background color. Some I think like this work quite well, even though the text is kind of hard to read, kind of to scrutinize a little bit because it's so lightly printed on there. But yeah, I think certain background colors work well with this sort of jacket design as opposed to others. But it's really a personal preference thing. Title page, contents. Here's the illustration. And for the Infinity Clue, I have the original Wanderer versus the reissue Wanderer. And again, it's a more posed original art with a lot going on from the original plot as opposed to a posed action shot, as you have here. And each has their pluses and minuses, so I still kind of have to go for the first Wanderer books. I think the original art and design and layout, that's how most people would have encountered it. But all the redos on the reissues are still good and solid. I just don't think they have the whole spirit of the book like fully there because it's just a random action shot. Show you the rears. Again, here you have the Wanderer logos, and here you have a grab from the front. So again, nice that something's going on in the rear cover. And then give you a difference in spines. If you have all of these, they will match on the shelf. But of course, because there's more in this later version of jackets, if you have more of these, they'll go together more because they won't match this one or this original style. Show you the title page, contents. And again, you'll notice that the originals have a lot more tendency to have browning, whereas the paper stock on the reprints does not have that problem, and it's a lot brighter, whiter paper stock, like I always say with the plastic cover reprints of the original canon. So here we have books 71 through 73. For the first two, I have the original Wanderer version, and then for 73, I have one of the reprints. So again, it's the same designs that are going to carry through. Here, the grab from the front cover is a little bit bigger, and you can see they let the arms go out, which is kind of strange. Looks like Frank's literally coming out of the book, like he's climbed up. He's in a cave and he's climbed up. He's climbing out a hole, literally out of the book. And here you have the Wanderer logos. Here's the illustration. This looks like a fun guy going to a party. Here's the illustration. And then for $1 Billion Ransom, they've changed the title page to befit what was then current and added the number in the series in a little box there. This is under the Minstrel imprint, so this is the one of the later reprintings. So this would be much later on in the 80s. So they've changed and added the Minstrel logo and changed the title page a little bit. And I do believe this one would have removed the internal illustrations. So I'm just flipping through real quick. Yeah, this does not have any of the internal illustrations. So when the Wanderer books switch over to the later Minstrel printings, that's usually the sign that it's, the second, if not third cover art. And by the time you've got a Minstrel, the original illustrations are long gone. And you can usually tell on the outside of the book, as you can see, the Minstrel is there. And usually on the Wanderer books, even in this style, they'll have it on the spine, of course, and here somewhere on the front. So if you're interested in tracking down copies with the original illustrations, which got phased out after a certain point, I forget which number. I don't know the specific number. They stopped doing the internal pictures, but if you're wanting those, then you'll want to be sure that you've got a copy that's an original, or it's still under the Wanderer imprint. And of course, for the early books, you'll want to stick to the original printings with the first style of covers. So here we have book 74, Tic Tac Terror, and then two versions of book 75. And as I was just saying, you'll look right here, you can see it still has the Wanderer logo. So this is a reprint, but it's still a Wanderer reprint. Then to show you the spines, how they match up. There's the Wanderer logo there on the bottom of each. Then there's the rear jackets. And you'll notice here, the actual page type the paper stock they've switched to is the whiter variety. So I don't know if these are exactly first printings, but at least by a certain point they switched over, and later books under the Wanderer imprint will not have the same problem with browning that the original earlier books will. So basically it's a lot easier to find first versions of books numbered, say, in the 70s and 80s than it is, 59 through 69. Those are most of mine. They do have some browning on them. So here is the first version of 75. I had to flip a ways here to get to one, but here is an illustration there, page 34. And then here in the reprint, ironically, the reprint has plenty of browning, so go figure. You can never quite tell with some of these just how it's going to turn out. I do love that there is a thank you to a particular person for his expert advice on nuclear devices, which of course instantly should arouse any kid's interest in terms of it being an interesting story, because that's not what you typically get in children's books. Yeah, I believe this one, even though it is a Wanderer, it has removed the internal illustrations. So again, it's kind of a general rule of thumb. Not all Wanderer printings retain the illustrations. So just to be on the safe side, you got to flip through and check. But if you want to make sure and be positive it's got the illustrations still intact, you'll want to make sure and get one of the original copies with the first style cover format, because these reprintings, it's kind of hit or miss. They didn't always retain the illustrations, and you have a 100% chance of having them in the original printing and like 50-50 on the reprint. So that's just something to keep in mind. And here you see it's starting to jump numbers because I'm already hitting the points where I'm missing particular books. So like I said before, it's getting tougher to fill in collection gaps for the digest because once they did the couple of reprints for the earlier books. There were none after that, particularly once they changed the cover art to the more modern designs in the 1990s. So it's getting a lot tougher because these books are getting much older and they're not as well known and as well read, say, as the original canon books, which have still been published and continue to still be published by Crossan and Dunlap. So here I have 76, 78, and 80. So, of course, 80 marks the final book that was done 100% under the Straightmeyer controlling syndicate with their ghostwriters and editors and everything. So, like I said at the start of this, this book, The Roaring River Mystery, could be considered the last in this sort of quasi-canon status. But I think you could safely also group in 81 through 85 in sort of that same scenario. But again, it's all open-ended, and you may read some of these and not like them at all if you've never read them before. So it's just, this weird sort of in-between period for the books. So here we have the original Wanderer style for 76. Show you title page, contents. Let's find an illustration. Here we go. And for 78, we have the later version. Here's the rear with some cover art. Contents. Yeah, this one is illustration free. This is kind of fun. It's kind of, with every book, I can't remember if it has illustrations or not. So here is book 80 in the original design. And I will admit, when I was a kid, I would read these in libraries, and then, I didn't realize that they had so many different cover varieties. And so sometimes I would read the same book more than once and get really confused, like read the same book a year later and I feel like I've read this before, but the cover's different, so it can't be. And then one day I found a library that had, I believe it was the Crimson Flame, and had 2 different cover arts and completely different jackets. And it was like, oh, that's what it is. I have read this book like several times already now. I believe this one does have the illustrations. Yeah. Here we go. I forgot, I do have the second version of Roaring River Mystery, so let me put these side by side really quick so you can see them. So again, pretty much the same part of the book, and a lot more focus on action in the reprint version. And again, each one is going to have their fans, so you can really go with either one. Neither one is bad. But again, for the first section of the digest, I always generally prefer the first Wanderer version, even though you're losing a lot of the art. There's the rear. Contents. And let's see if this has. I don't think that it does, but yeah, there are no illustrations here. So here we have books 81 and 83, and these are both secondary versions. 83 is, of course, the one book that the first printing has a completely different cover art design that was never used before and was never used again. So I would like to get a copy of that just to have it, because it's the one that has a completely different art design and layout. Why? Nobody really knows. So show you the rears. Again, you can tell, these were printed at slightly different times. This one, the text is all centered up here, and the image is a lot smaller. Here, the image is bigger. Text runs all the way down, and the ISBN number is bigger. So I believe this one was printed a little bit later, but again, that's just a guess. Show you the internals. Here's the illustration. Well, of course, this was printed later. I just realized this is a minstrel book, and this is a wanderer book. So that's of course why this is printed later. And as you can see, they've changed up the title page and put the number on. So pretty much all the books that Minstrel reprinted later on in the decade will have the front changed up like this. But everything else is the same, except, of course, the illustrations will have been removed. So as you can see, there are literally none included. So here are books 84 and 85. And as I said at the beginning, book 83 is the last book that had involvement from the Straightmeyer Syndicate. It was the last book that was written by their ghostwriters. So Simon & Schuster then did these two books, and then there was a year hiatus. So I believe these were 1985, and then 1986 there were no books, no new books. And then starting in 1987, like I said, they farmed it out to Mega Books, who then did the vast majority of books until Simon & Schuster took over much closer to the end. So these books, in a way, you know, I've never gotten to read the entire digest run back to back. I'm still trying to hunt down all the books that I'm missing. But you know, I'm sure stylistically there is a little bit of difference. I remember when I first read Desert Phantom, which is a really interesting digest. It's one of my favorites because it's one of the first that I read. It definitely had a different vibe to it, and of course the cover should indicate. It always makes me think of the Living Daylights, since it's also from you know, mid to late 80s, and you know, it's in the desert, and the boys are obviously on some sort of jeep, and Joe's on a mounted machine gun, which makes me think of the Airbase finale, where you have Koskov and Necros on a armored jeep, and Necros is on a mounted machine gun like Joe is here. Of course, this book predated the film by a little bit, but as a kid, I immediately thought that. I'm like, oh wow, this has some Bond elements. Of course, I've got to read this. So yeah, these two books are sort of like this in between period. So you know, 83 was the last to have involvement from the Straightmeyer Syndicate. Then Simon & Schuster did these two, and then Mega Books took over for the next long while. And of course, after these two, there were no books for a year. So yeah, that's where these fall in terms of history. And as you can see, these are earlier printings, and they don't have the little bit of the front cover on the back. But I don't know if these have the illustrations in them, but we will find out. Here they've changed the title layout on the title pages, gone for this sort of hollow letter approach, which is interesting. It makes it look different, and they've even added that to the contents there. This does not have the illustrations. It's also, I believe, a little bit shorter. I believe it's like 160 or 70 pages, whereas the previous books ran a little bit longer. And then for Skyfire Puzzle, same thing with the title pages, contents, and then I believe this one is also, completely illustration free. So there you have the two sort of transitional books. Again, I apologize for having to jump numbers because my collection is still ongoing and is sadly not complete. Here we have volumes 87, 88, and 90. These are, of course, under Mega Books being the primary creative force behind them. Of course, by this time, I believe I'm correct in saying all the illustrations had been completely phased out. So I'm pretty sure I'm correct in saying that illustrations are pretty much just going to be for the whole first wave of books up through about book 83. So again, I think with those two Simon & Schuster books, 84 and 85, those are the ones that kind of did away with the illustrations. I may be wrong on the exact numberings, so don't hold me to that. And if anybody knows for sure, definitely post in the comments below. So to show you the rears of these, you have the grabs from the front art on the rear, and of course no illustrations inside. And here they transitioned over to being on the Minstrel imprint, but they've kept the white or whited out or hollow contents listing there. And it's also on the chapters, but of course there are no illustrations inside. And it's the same here. And then here on volume 90, it's the same. And this is pretty much going to hold up for the most of the books to follow until we have the next major cover art changeover. Here we have volumes 92, 93, and 94. Again, nice cover art. They have a nice, not quite grittiness, but there is a reality to them. They're very grounded. But they all vary in how big they are, and then there's just a colored background behind them. Sometimes I wish they had just had the art across the whole book. Sometimes I feel like the Hardy Boys logo box kind of intrudes too much, but it does match across each one, so there is a certain style. So at least there is that level of similarity to them. Then here's the rear, each with some art from the front, and of course all three are on the Minstrel imprint. I'm not going to worry about showing the inside of all of these later books because, again, there's no internal illustrations and they're all exactly the same. They change up a little bit when they do a major format changeover with the covers. But if I kept showing all of the interiors, it'd just be the same thing over and over and over again on a lot of content pages. But they pretty much carry on until they hit the next big changeover. Here we have volumes 95, 96, and 97. Again, all three on the Minstrel imprint, and all depicting some sequence of action from the main plot. Show you the rears, and of course, condition is going to vary. I try to, always get good quality copies, or the best I can find. But sometimes you find inexpensive copies, or they're nice collection gap fillers. So I can live with a little bit of wear and tear, like on this volume. But I try my best to avoid that, but sometimes you're just so desperate to get, check off a number on your list of books you still need, and the price is right, and it's not terrible, but then you look more closely at it, and it's like, Here we have volumes 98, 99, and 100. Again, we're carrying with the same scenario. What's interesting about volume 100 is it is slightly linked to the original book, the Tower Treasure. Some of the characters come back, and some, it's sometimes labeled as a quasi-sequel. There's not always a whole lot of interaction between the digests and what occurred in the original canon. Each book is usually more of a standalone story, but occasionally there are throwbacks, and this is one of them that does that. But outside of just having a character reappear, that's really the main connection. So it's not really a sequel to the Tower Treasure, but it's just interesting and nice that they at least tried, and it was a tip of the hat there to the original series, and of course book one that got everything started. Of course, all three on the Minstrel imprint, all three carry some art from the front and have a completely different bold color choice. Here we have volumes 101, 102, and 104. Again, apologies, this is not a complete collection as of yet. Again, same thing, all three on the Minstrel imprint, all with a posed sort of action or discovery shot from their respective stories. And again, the matching rears with front cover art. Here we have volumes 106, 107, and 109. All three with a nice individual setup from each individual book. I think they hit a nice sweet spot in terms at this point of having either an action scene or an important scene of discovery or something from the climax of each book. And again, they're, rather realistic in style. As you can see by volume 106, they were already incorporating, modern elements, which, are sort of charmingly dated now. So this one deals heavily with video games at the time. And you can tell by the display on the cover and the way the artist rendered it, it's definitely charmingly dated to this time period, particularly compared to now. But most of these plots still hold up really well. I have not read all of the digests. I've read a good number of them, but I wanted to make sure to. I'm trying to fill my collection and complete it first because I'd like to do a nice chronological read through, which is what I'm doing with the canon books. I'm trying to get through all the original texts in order first, which I've never got to do before. And then once I do that, I'm going to move on to the digests and start reading them chronologically because I'd like to get the real experience of having bought these one at a time and read them over time and see how they grew and developed and stuff. So a good number of these I have not read yet because of that. Curiosity may get the better of me, and I may read a few more. But again, I'm trying to complete my collection before so I can do a complete read through, and then I can evaluate, if there are any stinkers in the bunch or some nice hidden gems and things like that. Here are the rear covers, again with some nice grabs from the front of each. Here we have 110 through 112, and again, all pretty nice cover arts. And again, in the same matching style. Show you the rears. Of course, all three on the minstrel imprint. Here we have volumes 113 through 115, and here you can see a shift away from, like I said, all the covers having a nice grounded quality to them. There's a usage of a lot bolder colors and some almost having a sort of pastel look to them, a definite, a lesser sense of grounding. And then the Radical Moves cover is always kind of made me chuckle because it's like, hey, the Hardy Boys are going to be rad skateboarders now. Yeah, because that's cool now. In sort of the, hideously dated kind of fashion. But, it was popular at the time, I guess. But here with 114 and 115, for a certain era of these books, these covers got much more. I mean, they're not kiddie looking, but they have a certain cartoony vibe to them almost, and that combined with the very bold, primary colors, it just reinforces that. And you definitely notice it when all these books are side by side because for a while they were very grounded and realistic looking, and then they switch to this, and then the backgrounds get even bolder and more garish. So just an interesting stylistic thing I've noticed. Why they did that, I don't know, but it's just something that exists for the books at this time period. Here we have 116 through 118, and while the first two are again going back to that more grounded style, you can see with the background color and the same sort of influence. They're not cartoonish, but they have a contrastier feel to them. And 118 is, they're still drawn rather realistically, but it's a much more fantastical plot and title and such. And you have a monster on the front cover, so yeah, it's a different sort of emphasis going on. Show you the rear, and here they've enlarged the rear photo portion from the front and standardized the text a little bit more. So they've made the text a bit bigger, easier to read, more grabbing to the eye. Here we have 119 through 121. Same thing, still on the minstrel imprint and still with the slightly different style to the art, but all three are still pretty grounded. Here's the rear covers. Again, the rear image is a little bit bigger now on this era of the covers, and unfortunately my 121 has a little bit of damage on the back, but nothing horrible. Here's 122 through 124, and again it's this sort of blend of the earlier more grounded realistic covers and then having more fantastical elements being introduced. And if you didn't know there was another entity involved in making these at this point, you might begin to suspect that because the plots, are starting to get more fantastical and starting to try and be, hipper and cooler and go along more with the times in which they were written. Now, again, I haven't read everything from this era, but, some of the ones I've read have been really good and some have been, merely okay. But, it's just when you have this large number of books, there's obviously going to be hits and misses. So here we have volumes 126, 127, and 131. Interesting that these two have almost the exact same background color. Again, it seems like here we've returned more to a grounded style without those slightly cartoonish elements of the books that immediately preceded them. I should also mention that once the main changeover happened around books 84, 85, they started adding taglines to the cover, which they're okay. They're not really necessary, but I've always had a soft spot for these sort of taglines. They're much in the way of old school movie taglines, which always have the inherently cheesy portions, sometimes working in the title of the book, which I must admit I have a certain fondness for. They're nowhere near as quirky and goofy as the really awesome ones on the Case Files series, which are really, really cheesy most of the time. They make each case file look like a low budget, gritty 80s action movie more than a Hardy Boys book. But the ones here serve their purpose, and I kind of miss taglines being on front covers of books. Then here's the rear covers. Here we have volumes 132, 134, and 135. Now, these are the last three that I have in the minstrel books that have this style of artwork. Everything from this point onward will be the next big change up in book series and the cover designs, which is what I went over at the start of the video. So these are the last three that I have that are in this phase of the book designs. So here we have volumes 137 through 139. And as I said before, this is the big shakeup in terms of cover art design. Again, like I said at the start, I'm not really a fan of this particular design. I mean, they're all right, but it's the weird blend of photorealism and sort of cut and paste collage style, and they have a slight garish quality to them as well that I've never been able to quite shake. So these three in particular are all right, but you also have all this other stuff cluttering up. The titles being sort of either like the old school lettering tape or looking like the departure board in an airport is kind of weird, and that fits with the logo, but then making the H&B kind of big and weird looking. I don't know. It's never quite agreed with me. And then having the author title down here, but in black, so it kind of looks like you just had an old roll of labeling tape and you just literally stuck it on the book cover. But then you also have the title number here in this black box, so it also sticks out further. And sometimes you have the minstrel logo here on the side. And then worst of all, I hate the taglines are printed in these little comic style speech bubbles, and they're all yellow. And again, it's like having a big sticker on your book, but of course it's printed on there. So it's just, these are very busy covers, and I mean they're okay. Unlike the final version, which doesn't have the Hardy Boys on the covers at all, which is quite strange. They are on these, but yeah, it's just, I don't know. I'm not really a fan of this particular era, and like I said before, these all have yellow spines. Now, what's interesting here is you see these two are minstrel copies, and this I believe is a later printing, but here they've added a red border on the top and the bottom, so it again doesn't match. And it's also, I don't know if you can see this, but it's a tiny bit bigger. So I believe this is a later reprint that fits the slightly larger size of some of the later books. So sometimes they printed the slightly earlier ones, but with the slightly larger size of some of the later books that were under the different cover art. So that also makes it very frustrating when you try to put these on a shelf next to each other. Not only do the spines change, but sometimes in the various printings, the height changes as well. So that's something to note. And again, you probably won't be able to see, but it's ever so slightly taller than the others, which is just kind of frustrating. And then here on the rear, most of them have a red backing, but then some have a purple backing. Why? I don't exactly know, but that's just how they did it on some of them. And like I said, this is a slightly later printing, and it's under the Aladdin imprint, which was what the final cover art and last books were printed under, which also explains why, again, you can see here, it's just a little bit taller, just to be annoying, you know. But anyway, that's how these can slightly vary. The only other variants that I've found is some of these were, I guess, sold at Scholastic book fairs, so they carry the Scholastic imprint. Um, so they'll have the Scholastic logo on the spine. But what's really frustrating on the Scholastic copies of the final cover art and some of these is that they don't include the number of the book. So it becomes really frustrating because the sizes can vary, and then they have Scholastic logos on the spine, so they don't fit with the others, and then they don't have the number anywhere on the book, which why they did that I have no idea, but it's really frustrating when you take a book off the shelf and you can't remember what number it is and it's not printed anywhere in or on the book you have in your hands. You have to go to another book or look it up online to remember what number it is. But anyway, that's the only other minor printing variance there is. And here you have an example, like I was saying about the Scholastic books. This one also includes it on the front cover, but as you can see, for Slam Dunk Sabotage, there's no number on the book cover. There's no number on the spine, no number on the rear cover, and no number inside, which is infuriating. So just keep that in mind. The book itself is exactly the same. The dimensions seem to be a little bit bigger, like it's ever so slightly taller, just to be slightly annoying because it doesn't match. But yeah, otherwise it's the same book, same text, cover, printing, everything. So here you'll notice that on these particular copies, they changed the bubbles and all the background colors to red, which happens on some. So they kind of alternated. And then here, the title's got a yellow background. Here it's red, so it's not exactly, 100% the same across the board. The logos are now white instead of yellow. It kind of varies. Same thing, the covers are really busy in terms of so many things going on. So, they're serviceable, but, there's a lot of clutter going on. And again, these are just not my favorite era of Hardy covers. So here, just to be different, this one has a blue backing instead of red. These two are minstrel copies. This, of course, is Scholastic, so their stuff is on the back, and of course, no ISBN number because this was primarily for school book fairs. So yes, there, as you can see, there is some variance in these, even though they're supposed to be the same. So you have certain ones that are, I guess, a different color just to be different. Now here you have books numbers 154 through 156. What's important about these is 154 is when Simon & Schuster took back over from farming it out to the Mega Books company. So this is the book where Simon & Schuster took back over the production and ghostwriting and took back over producing these books 100%. And it remained that way all the way through book 190, which is the final volume. So from this point onward, it's now completely under Simon & Schuster. Covers, they're I think a little bit better. I think some of these are better than others. Of course, you still have the comic bubble, and now on these, they're put all the way up here. So here it looks like the wolf is saying something, and here it's just the background because they don't connect to anything. I don't know why they put them in comic speech bubbles because it looks like the book is talking to you, I guess. Maybe that was the idea. Again, they've now gone to red backing for everything and then the title in white instead of yellow, which I do think kind of works better. I think the yellow was maybe a bit much. Of course, all these spines are still yellow, and these are all original copies, so none of them have any size differences, and they all have red backings. And I'm kind of thinking, I don't know this for sure, but I'm kind of thinking that when they had different colors on the back, it was either alternate printings like a Scholastic printing or something, or maybe a later printing. But again, that's just my own personal guesswork. Or it could just be that some books decided they felt like being different. So So here we have volumes 159 through 161, and this is where we transition over with this particular book to the final style of covers. Again, the same thing with the different printings having a slightly different size carries on here. Certain later printings and later books in general will be that slightly larger size, so that means they stick out like maybe an extra half inch compared to the other books. And I think a few under this cover art got reprinted under this style, but I'm not for certain. I've heard some reference to that. And anytime they reprinted books that were this normal size, they would of course be the slightly larger size, as I showed on the last few books. On some of them having that slight extra amount of height clearance because they're just ever slightly so bigger. So anyway, these are the final two in this style of art, and even though this is, you know, the first time you had Hardy Boys books without the Hardy Boys on the cover, like I said at the start of all this, I can see what they were going for. It's like you're pulling out an actual, literally a case file, even though these are not the case files. You have all of this stuff that leads you to believe that, and even a little bit of like crime scene tape across the top, which is an interesting choice, I guess. The other thing to note, I know at the beginning I showed one with a blue spine, but they started these by having a spine the color that matches the rear. So the whole notion of it being an actual envelope or folder, carries across. So, and you also have a sticker with the title literally typed out as if it were on a typewriter. So again, the notion that when you see a bunch of these on a shelf, you see all the spines sticking out, it's like you're actually pulling a folder out, which, it's a cute touch. I get what they were going for, but, it definitely doesn't have the same immediacy or appeal or connection that, actually having the main characters on the cover would. But there is something to be said about the minimalism, and there is maybe a greater sense of mystery because you're just presented with a very stark image, and you don't have the lead characters on the front. So I'm kind of on the fence on these. At first, I when I was growing up, I hated them. I thought they just looked boring and dull. But over time, I can kind of see what they were going for. So show you the rears of these. So these, of course, are red, and this, of course, has the file folder design. And just to show you how annoying it is trying to match all the spines, as you can see, they don't match at all. So you go from the original style, then you get to the checkerboard era, then you go to this vivid yellow that doesn't match anything, and you're like, okay, well maybe, and then they go to this, which doesn't match anything either, but at least it's not this super bright yellow. So there you have it. Here are the next volumes. As you can see, these two are Scholastic editions, so that means they have these Scholastic logos. They are of the slightly later book printing eras because they're a little thinner and a little bit taller. So this being an original printing of book 164, as you can see, I can barely kind of fit my finger there just to show that these two are slightly taller. Again, it's something very minor, but when you start getting into collecting the digest, it's something you're going to notice on the mid to late 90s and 2000s era of books. And especially if you have to do any books going vertically, you can't really do it because certain ones will stick out. Show you the spines, just so you can see. There's the Scholastic logos there on the bottom, and of course that means none of the spines match up because all the later printings are taller. They moved everything. They removed the minstrel logo, so it just doesn't match. And again, because these are Scholastic copies, there is no ISBN number, and it's just, all blank down here. My next three, and as you can see, they're all slightly different heights. This one in the middle for 167 is slightly taller than the other two. So there's, again, variance in the printing sizes between books, and it's not just the Scholastic ones. Of course, this being a Scholastic copy, as you can clearly see, there is no number printed on the book. Again, why they did that, I guess maybe to keep you guessing that you didn't know which one you bought, so you might be enticed to buy more. I have no idea, but again, it's really frustrating because when you get to the digest, they go up to 190, so it can be very difficult to remember which book is which, particularly since they don't have as recognizable covers. Now, this book in the middle, 167, is a later printing, which is why it's a little bit taller. And as you can see, being a later printing, it carries the blue spine they switched over to. So again, you now have variants in these once more. So the later books will be this blue color. So even if you have all original printings of this particular design, for the last number of books, they switched to having a blue spine once again, like the classic canon books. So again, they will not match. So, but at least they kept everything else, and at least once again, we have a Hardy Boys series that does have a blue spine. Here are my next three with 2 Scholastic copies, and of course, this being a different printing, so of course, it's just that ever so little bit taller. And again, while I say, I got used to this, sort of cover design, there is a sort of uniformity, and the jackets just don't have the same level of individuality. They very much blend together, especially when you have them side by side like this. So yeah, I've kind of gotten used to them, and I've read some of these. Again, I'm waiting to complete my digest collection and do a whole chronological reread. But certain ones of the ones I've read have been actually surprisingly very good. But then others have been just they've been decent. I haven't really come across like a very bad one. It's actually very rare that there's an actual like just bad or terrible or appalling Hardy Boys entry. But again, I haven't read every single book yet because I'm harboring this crazy desire to just read everything in order, and that way cover the ones I haven't read yet in sequence. Or the next three, again, with one being a Scholastic edition with, again, no numbering, which it's like if you were to take one thing off, it's like, did it have to be the numbering? And of course, that means no price or ISBN number on the back, so you are spared that. But again, makes it look a little bit blank down here. Here are my next three, and this is interesting. By this point, we've already transitioned over to the blue spines as we're approaching the end of the digest series. But here we have a Scholastic edition that still sticks with the standard tan or folder color spine. Not sure exactly what you call that type of color. So when you look at these first two are original printings with the numbers. This one, being Scholastic, does not have the number, and it is the book that comes after these two, but they still have stuck with this color spine. So I guess they just, again, there's sometimes no rhyme or reason to this stuff, but that's another thing that can be very confusing if you're trying to put these in order, especially because they don't have numbering on the Scholastic copies. The rears are pretty much the same. On this last revision, all they were doing was changing the spine color for the most part. And then these two, books 183 and 185, are the last that I currently have of the digest. I have not yet gotten book 190, which is the final digest book. So all of these are in the final style, and they have the blue spines. And these are, of course, the Aladdin versions. Show you the rear. Well, since that is the last digest that I have, you might think that I would be done, but you would be wrong. I have to mention the one standalone book that is still, it's part of the digest series and was reprinted a number of times. So I have two different editions, but this is the standalone Ghost Stories volume. And this is a volume, I guess it's most similar to the Detective Handbook in terms of how it relates to the series. It's was published, I believe the original publishing date was 1984, and the Wanderer line, and then was republished several more times, this being the last two versions. So this being from the mid 90s, and this being from the early 2000s. And it's the same text, but it is a compilation of short stories, and all with supernatural or spooky themes, designed probably most likely to try and sell a bunch around, every Halloween, every October. But what's interesting about this, and it's been a little while since I've read this particular volume, but from what I remember, several of the stories, yeah, there is a bit of a Scooby Doo vibe, and that they're going to have to unmask whoever the villain is at the end, and the supernatural is revealed to not be supernatural at all. But if I'm remembering correctly, there are several stories, if not all of them, definitely leave a bit of ambiguity that maybe they didn't quite figure out everything, or maybe it was something supernatural after all. Hence, that it's sold as a book of ghost stories. And the first covers were, they fit with the way the books looked at the time. But these two, I think, tried to amp up. Particularly this one tries to amp up the horror vibe. They've drawn this figure to be much more visceral and in your face than the earlier cover art. And then this one, it's a bit more simplistic, but you can definitely tell the vibe they're going for with these. Just show you the rear. Each one follows the design at the time of the other books when it's published. And as you can see, this one, of course, is that tiny bit taller. So, with that being said, this is the end of my digest collection, and I have a good majority of the books. I'm still nowhere near being complete, and I'd love to have every cover art variation. But for right now, I'm just trying to fill in the gaps. But I did want to talk through these since there are so many, and they ran all the way through the year 2005. And once they ended, it was really the last series to have the traditional Hardy Boys format. After this, they've had runs of comics. There's the Undercover Brothers series. They've done third person alternating narratives. First person alternating narratives instead of the traditional omniscient narrator. And then there's been lines of Hardy Boys books, but designed for much younger readers. So there's been a bunch of different things, but there has not been a traditional Hardy Boys series since the digests were ended. And I should also mention that since the digest ran to 2005, they did apparently work in some of the stories that did not get used for the case files once the case files were ended. And so some of the later books have a darker tone because they were intended or originally written as case files, which was, of course, the companion series that was much darker and intended for more mature teen readers. That started in 1987. Which will be the subject of my next video, and is also a very long, very time-consuming quest. I'm still working on that. I'm almost complete, but there's, of course, 127 case files to track down and find. And once those got printed once or twice, they have never been reprinted, so this just keeps going. So anyway, I hope this has been informative and enjoyable. And again, this is not meant to be definitive or authoritative, and I must again point to the fan sites for further information. I will link to all of them in the description, but especially most of all, hardyboys.us is really the go-to source for everything Hardy related. So I'm going to continue to work on this, and hopefully I can get all the volumes I'm missing and get all the way up to 190, and then when I do a read through and just see if I can find any hidden gems and reread ones I haven't read in a long time. So as always, thanks again so very much for watching, everybody, and happy hunting.